Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. The morning air tasted of honey and jasmine, sweet enough to make Dr. Ilara Vance pause in her daily walk to the Botanical Research Center. She breathed deeply, watching the golden pollen drift like fairy dust from the towering memoria trees that lined every street of New Eden. Their massive trunks stretched toward the artificial sky dome, their canopy so dense and beautiful that most citizens had forgotten this moon had once been barren rock. Ilara smiled at Mrs. Chin, who tended a small flower garden outside her apartment complex. The elderly woman looked up with the same placid contentment that graced every face in their perfect society, her eyes clear but somehow distant, like someone perpetually waking from a pleasant dream. "Good morning, Dr. Vance," Mrs. Chin called, her voice carrying that gentle, unhurried cadence that marked all conversations in New Eden. "The trees are particularly beautiful today, aren't they?" "They always are," Ilara replied, though something in her chest tightened, a feeling she couldn't name. Mrs. Chin had been saying the exact same thing every morning for how long? Months? Years? The distinction felt strangely unimportant, the way all time seemed to flow together in their peaceful world. The research center's bioscanner recognized Ilara's genetic signature, and the crystalline doors whispered open. Inside, her colleagues moved with the same unhurried grace, their faces bearing expressions of mild interest and contentment. Dr. Hayes looked up from his microscope, blinking slowly. "Ah, Ilara. Good to see you. I was just examining some fascinating spore samples, though I can't quite recall where I obtained them." He chuckled softly, the sound neither troubled nor curious. This was normal. In New Eden, the details of yesterday seemed less important than the beauty of today. The authority had taught them that dwelling on the past bred only conflict and sorrow. Why burden oneself with such things when the present offered such peace? Ilara settled at her workstation, pulling up her current project, a comprehensive study of the memoria tree's pollen production cycles. The trees were miraculous, engineered by the founders centuries ago to terraform this moon and provide breathable atmosphere. Their pollen didn't just create oxygen. It seemed to have psychological benefits too, promoting the calm, cooperative society that made New Eden humanity's crown jewel. She was deep in cellular analysis when her soil scanner detected an anomaly in Sector 7, near the old industrial district. The readings showed a dense concentration of pre-colonial materials buried beneath the root system of a particularly ancient memoria grove. Pre-colonial artifacts were rare. Most had been recycled or naturally decomposed over the centuries of their peaceful existence. The journey to Sector 7 took her through the quieter residential areas, where children played gentle games in the golden-hazed parks and adults sat reading or conversing in soft, meandering voices. No one seemed to notice her passing, though she wasn't trying to hide. Privacy and personal space were respected absolutely in New Eden, another gift of their perfect society. The excavation site revealed itself as soon as she activated her deep soil scanner. 6 feet down, encased in a hermetically sealed container of pre-colonial design, lay what appeared to be a seed vault. Ilara's pulse quickened with scientific excitement. This could contain genetic material from Earth's original biosphere, specimens that might have been lost to time. The excavation took 3 hours. As she worked, the afternoon pollen fall began, that daily shower of golden dust that made the air shimmer and everyone's thoughts soften around the edges. She found herself stopping frequently to breathe deeply, to simply exist in the moment. But each time, something pulled her back to the work, an unusual persistence she couldn't explain. The vault was smaller than expected, about the size of a briefcase, made from materials that had resisted centuries of decay. The seal broke with a soft hiss, releasing stale air that smelled faintly of metal and fear, though Ilara couldn't say why she thought of fear. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were dozens of seed samples in climate-controlled containers. But there was something else, a data storage device, its surface scratched and worn but still functional. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she extracted it. In all her years studying New Eden's botanical history, she had never found direct records from the original colonists. Back at the lab, she worked late into the evening, her colleagues having drifted away as the sun set and the nocturnal pollen release began. The data pad's restoration process was delicate, requiring equipment that seemed almost too complex for their peaceful society. When had they last needed to recover damaged information? What was there to recover in a world where each day brought fresh contentment? The first files that opened were routine botanical surveys, written in the clinical language of scientists documenting their new world's transformation. The early colonists had been thorough, cataloging every stage of the terraforming process with admirable precision. But as Alara read deeper, she noticed subtle changes in the writing. The entries became more personal, less formal. References to difficulties with the indigenous population appeared, though New Eden had no indigenous life forms. Mentions of social unrest and memory-related incidents began to pepper the scientific reports. Her coffee grew cold as she read, the lab's automated systems dimming the lights to encourage rest. But sleep felt impossible. These records painted a picture of the early colony that bore no resemblance to the peaceful transition described in their history texts. The final accessible file was dated almost 3 centuries ago, its data corrupted by time and damage. The text appeared in fragments, disjointed words floating across her screen like pieces of a shattered mirror. The trees are not what we thought. The pollen contains compounds that affect memory consolidation severely compromised. Generations will forget sweet-smelling poison that makes them docile. They don't remember the wars anymore. They don't remember the hate, but they don't remember love either. True love requires memory of pain. Director says this is mercy. I say this is murder of the soul. If anyone reads this, the seeds in compartment 7, Terminator sequence, can reverse the neural suppression. But should it be reversed, to remember is to suffer, to forget is to live in a beautiful lie. They're coming for me now. The sweet smell grows stronger. I can feel my thoughts softening. My name was. The file ended there, cutting off mid-sentence like a scream interrupted by silence. Alara stared at the screen until the words blurred together. The lab around her felt suddenly oppressive, its clean lines and soft lighting no longer comforting but sterile. Outside, the Memoria trees swayed gently in the artificial breeze, their pollen catching the moonlight like stars falling to earth. She thought of Mrs. Chen's daily greeting, of Dr. Hayes's perpetual mild confusion, of her own strange inability to recall details from her past beyond a few months. She thought of the children in the parks, playing games that seemed to have no winners or losers, no passion or competition. She thought of the utter absence of art galleries, music venues, or theaters in their perfect city, who needed such things when reality itself was beautiful enough. The pollen drifted past her window, and for a moment, Alara felt her concerns beginning to soften, her questions becoming less urgent. The effects were subtle, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Like a gentle drug that made everything seem less important, less worth remembering. She forced herself to stand, to move away from the window. In the storage compartment of the ancient vault, her hands found what the corrupted file had mentioned, a small collection of seeds unlike any in New Eden's current ecosystem. Seeds that, according to the fragmentary data, could produce plants whose pollen contained compounds that might counteract the Memoria tree's effects. Terminator seeds, designed to end the sweet, forgetful peace of their garden paradise. Alara held them in her palm, feeling their weight. In her other hand, she clutched the data pad with its terrible, wonderful, incomplete truth. Outside, New Eden slept peacefully under its golden snow of memory-erasing pollen, and she alone carried the knowledge that their entire existence might be built on a foundation of forgotten suffering. The question that would haunt her through the long night ahead was simple and terrible. If ignorance was bliss, was knowledge a curse? Dawn brought another shower of golden pollen, and with it, the familiar softening of sharp thoughts that had kept Alara awake. She stood at her apartment window, watching the beautiful particles drift past, and felt her memories of the previous night's discovery becoming hazy around the edges. The data pad lay on her bedside table, and she had to concentrate to remember why it was important. This was the horror of it. The forgetting wasn't violent or sudden. It was gentle, natural, like sinking into warm water. Only the notes she had frantically scribbled to herself in the pre-dawn hours kept her tethered to the terrible truth. Remember the vault. Remember the seeds. Remember the lies. Don't trust your memory after morning pollen fall. The peace is artificial. The forgetting is intentional. Find others who remember. Reading her own handwriting felt like discovering messages from a stranger, though she recognized the urgency in every hastily scrawled word. She sealed the data pad and the Terminator seeds in a biohazard container designed to filter out airborne contaminants, then tucked it into her research bag. At the lab, Dr. Hayes greeted her with the same mild confusion as always. "Good morning, Alara. Strange dreams last night. Can't quite recall what about, but they felt important somehow." "Dreams often do," she replied carefully. "Do you ever wonder why we have such difficulty remembering things from more than a few weeks ago?" Hayes blinked slowly, considering. "The authority teaches that focusing too much on the past can lead to unhappiness. Better to embrace each day fresh. Though sometimes I feel like I'm missing something essential. Like trying to recall a song when you can only remember the melody." Alara spent the morning researching memory formation and retention, using the research center's extensive database. What she found made her blood run cold. Studies from centuries past detailed the mechanisms by which certain airborne compounds could interfere with long-term memory consolidation. The research was thorough, clinical, and bore the signature of the authorities' medical division. They knew. They had always known. During her lunch break, she ventured into the city's older districts, following maintenance tunnels that led away from the dense groves of memoria trees. The further she traveled from the pollen-heavy central areas, the more her thinking cleared. It was like emerging from underwater, gasping for mental air she hadn't realized she was missing. In the industrial sector, where the trees grew sparser and the pollen concentration was lower, she noticed differences in the population. People moved with slightly more urgency. Their conversations carried undertones of something she couldn't identify at first. Then it struck her, they were arguing. Not violently, but with genuine disagreement, real emotion. A small group had gathered around a man speaking from atop an old shipping container. His words carried the passion that seemed so absent in the central districts. "Remember when we chose this life, not had it chosen for us. The authority speaks of peace, but what good is peace bought with the murder of memory? What good is happiness that requires the death of the self?" The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in confusion. Alara noticed that many of the listeners bore intricate tattoos, scarification patterns that covered their arms and faces in deliberate designs. The speaker himself was heavily marked, his skin a canvas of intentional wounds that had healed into beautiful, painful art. As the crowd dispersed, she approached him. Up close, she could see that his tattoos weren't merely decorative. They were words, dates, names carved into flesh. A living journal written in scars. "You're Dr. Vance?" he said before she could introduce herself. "Botanical Research Center. I'm Silas." He gestured to his marked arms. "I remember you from before you stopped remembering me." "I'm sorry I don't." "Of course you don't. That's the point." His eyes held a sharpness she rarely saw in New Eden, an intensity that felt almost alien after years of gentle, unfocused gazes. The pollen affects different people differently. Some of us are naturally resistant. Others have learned to fight it through alternative methods. He touched one of the raised scars on his forearm. Pain disrupts the neural pathways the pollen targets. Intense physical sensation can sometimes break through the chemical suppression. We've been trying to wake people up for decades, but it's like shouting at sleepwalkers. "You're the under tree," Alara breathed, remembering fragments from the corrupted data file. "We remember that name, yes. The ones who live under the trees but refuse their gift." Silas studied her face. "You found something. I can see it in your eyes, that look people get when they remember they've been forgetting." Alara's hand moved instinctively to her research bag. "If what you're saying is true, then our entire society is built on the corpses of our ancestors' memories. Every generation forgets the one before. We live in an eternal present, like goldfish in a beautiful bowl." Silas gestured toward the distant spires of New Eden Center, where the memoria trees grew thickest. "Tell me, Doctor, when did you last see someone truly angry? When did you last witness grief that lasted more than a day? Love that spanned years rather than moments?" The questions hit her like physical blows. She realized she couldn't answer any of them. "Come," Silas said. "There are others you should meet. Others who choose to remember despite the cost." He led her deeper into the industrial district, through passages that seemed designed to avoid the major pollen distribution points. The further they went from the trees, the more alive the world became. Colors seemed sharper, emotions more vivid. It was overwhelming after a lifetime of gentle, muted experiences. The undertree's gathering place was hidden in an abandoned atmospheric processing station, its air scrubbers still functional enough to filter out most of the memory-suppressing pollen. Inside, perhaps 30 people sat in a loose circle, their bodies marked with the same deliberate scarification as Silas. As Alara entered, she saw them react to her presence with a mixture of hope and suspicion. These people looked at her, really looked, with focus and intensity that made her uncomfortable. In the central districts, gazes were always soft, unfocused, polite. Here, eyes burned with purpose. "This is Dr. Alara Vance," Silas announced. "She's found something." An older woman with intricate spirals carved into her cheeks leaned forward. "Show us." Alara hesitated, then pulled out the biohazard container. The room fell silent as she opened it and withdrew the data pad and the small collection of Terminator seeds. "These are from before," she said. "From the original colony. The data is fragmentary, but it suggests that the trees are weapons," finished a young man whose entire scalp bore scarified text in tiny, precise letters. "That the pollen doesn't just make oxygen. It makes us forget." "You knew." "We've suspected for years," the older woman said. "But suspicion isn't proof. And proof without solution is just suffering." She looked at the seeds with hungry eyes. "What are those?" "According to the records, they're designed to produce plants that can counteract the memory suppression. But the data is incomplete. I don't know what side effects." "Side effects?" Silas laughed bitterly. "Doctor, we live in a world where children grow up not knowing their grandparents' names. Where art consists only of pleasant landscapes because no one remembers enough tragedy to create anything with depth. Where love is shallow because it requires no memory of shared experience to sustain it. What side effect could be worse than what we already endure?" The older woman stood, and Alara noticed that her scars formed readable text. Names, dates, fragments of personal history that would otherwise be lost to the pollen's gentle erosion. "My name is carved here," the woman said, touching her cheek. "My daughter's name. My husband's death date. The day we arrived on this moon. Every important moment of my life is written in my flesh because it's the only place the pollen can't reach it." She looked at Alara with eyes that held decades of accumulated grief. "Do you understand what it means to choose pain over peace? To scar yourself rather than forget who you are?" "But if everyone remembered," Alara said slowly, "if the suppression ended and people recalled their full history, according to these records, our ancestors came here fleeing wars, violence, hatred. Is it mercy to give them back those memories? Is it murder to take them away?" Silas countered. "Look around you, doctor. Do you see anyone here who chose this scarification lightly? We've all decided that our pain is worth preserving. That our grief, our anger, our complicated love is what makes us human." The young man with the text-covered scalp spoke up. "I've got the entire history of my family carved here, back 6 generations. Wars, betrayals, loves, losses. It hurts to remember, but without that pain, I'm just a ghost pretending to be alive." Alara looked around the circle, seeing decades of accumulated human experience written in deliberate wounds. Each person had chosen to remember, to carry the weight of history rather than drift in the gentle forgetfulness of the pollen. But her mind kept returning to the morning scene. Mrs. Chin tending her flowers with simple contentment, Dr. Hayes conducting his research without the burden of failure or frustration, children playing games where no one could lose because no one remembered what losing meant. "There's something else," she said quietly. "The data mentions a memory ward. A place where the authority keeps people who are naturally resistant to the pollen." The room fell silent. "We've heard rumors," Silas said finally. "People who disappear. Citizens who ask too many questions about the past or show signs of retaining long-term memories. If it exists, it would be in the authority's central complex. The medical spire." The older woman's voice carried the weight of old fear. "None of our people have ever returned from there." Alara made her decision. "I need to see it. If we're going to use these seeds, if we're going to choose for everyone whether to remember or forget, we need to understand the full cost of both options." Silas nodded slowly. "The medical spire is in the heart of the pollen district. Even we can't survive there long without protection. But—" he touched one of his newer scars, still pink with recent healing. "Pain can cut through the chemical fog for short periods. Long enough, maybe." "I can get you inside," the older woman said. "I worked there before I chose to remember. Before I learned to forget forgetting." As the group began planning their infiltration, Alara felt a strange sensation, the weight of purpose, of meaningful choice. For the first time in her life, She was planning something that felt important beyond the gentle daily routine of their peaceful existence. But beneath the excitement lay a growing dread. What if the memory ward revealed that the authorities' choice had been the right one? What if remembering truly was a cruelty worse than forgetting? What if the beautiful lie of their garden paradise was preferable to whatever terrible truth lay buried beneath its roots? The medical spire rose from the heart of New Eden like a needle piercing the sky, its surface gleaming white against the golden haze of eternal pollenfall. Elara approached it in the pre-dawn hours when the concentration of memory-suppressing particles was at its lowest, though still high enough to make her thoughts swim if she breathed too deeply. The older woman, who had carved the name Maria into her palm so she would never forget it, had provided her with credentials and access codes from her former life as a medical technician. But those memories were fragmentary, interrupted by years of chemical suppression before she had chosen the pain of scarification to preserve her identity. "The ward is on the 47th floor," Maria had whispered as they parted in the shadowy loading dock. "Sublevel designation M7. Tell them you're conducting a routine botanical survey of air filtration systems. They won't question it. Questioning requires remembering why questions matter." The security checkpoint waved Elara through with the same gentle disinterest that characterized all interactions in the pollen-heavy zones. The guard's eyes held that familiar soft focus, their smiles placid and distant. One of them made a comment about the lovely morning air, and his companion agreed with the automatic warmth that masked the absence of genuine opinion. The elevator's ascent through the spire was silent except for the whisper of filtered air. Each floor looked identical. Clean corridors lined with offices where authority personnel conducted the administrative duties of paradise with quiet efficiency. No one seemed to notice her, though she wasn't trying to hide. In a world where curiosity had been chemically suppressed, an unfamiliar face simply didn't register as significant. The 47th floor felt different the moment the elevator doors opened. The air carried a sharp, clinical scent that cut through the honey sweetness of the pollen. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that seemed jarring after years of New Eden's soft, golden glow. Signs directed her toward Memory Research Division, authorized personnel only. The corridors here were narrower, more maze-like, as if designed to confuse visitors. But Elara's botanical training had taught her to navigate complex systems, to follow the flow of resources to their source. She found the entrance to M7 behind a door marked Atmospheric Studies Quarantine Protocols. Her stolen credentials opened it with a soft chime that sounded unnaturally loud in the hushed corridor beyond. The first thing that struck her was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of New Eden streets, but the oppressive hush of a place where sound itself had been deemed dangerous. The second thing was the smell, the absence of pollen replaced by the sterile odor of medical facilities and something else, something that reminded her of fear. The ward stretched ahead of her in a long corridor lined with observation windows. Through the first, she saw a middle-aged man sitting on a narrow bed, his hands pressed against his temples, rocking slightly. His lips moved constantly, as if he were reciting something vital he couldn't risk forgetting. The placard beside his window read, "Patient 23A, Natural Resistance to Mnemonic Suppressants. Acute Historical Retention Syndrome. Treatment, ongoing." Elara moved to the next window. A young woman sat at a small table, writing frantically in a notebook. Her movements were desperate, driven by some internal urgency that made Elara's chest tighten with sympathetic anxiety. The woman would write for a few moments, then tear out the page and begin again, trapped in an endless cycle of recording and discarding. Fascinating, isn't it? The voice behind her was calm, paternal, tinged with genuine warmth. Elara spun around to find a tall man in authority robes watching her with eyes that held more focus and intelligence than she had seen in anyone from the central districts. "Director Kalen," she breathed, recognizing him from the rare public addresses that marked New Eden's ceremonial occasions. "Dr. Vance. I've been expecting you." His smile was kind, understanding. "Your discovery of the seed vault was inevitable, I suppose. Someone of your intelligence and dedication was bound to find the fragments eventually. You knew." "We know everything that happens in our garden, Elara. May I call you Elara? We've been watching your work for some time, hoping you would come to understand the necessity of our choices." He gestured toward the observation windows. "Come, let me show you why we made them." She wanted to run, to flee back to the elevator and the safe forgetfulness of the pollen districts. But the data pad in her bag seemed to pulse with weight of unanswered questions. She followed him deeper into the ward. "Patient 31B, Kalen said, stopping before a window that looked in on an elderly woman who sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. She remembers her great-grandmother's stories about the Earth wars. Genocide, nuclear fire, the death of oceans. She hasn't spoken in 3 years. The memories play in an endless loop, and she experiences each atrocity as if it were happening now." The next window revealed a young man who had covered every surface of his room with writing, walls, floor, ceiling, all filled with cramped text. Patient 15C remembers his grandfather's memories of the colonial wars on Titan. Mass starvation, children sold into slavery, populations wiped out by engineered plagues. He writes constantly, trying to record everything before the memories consume him entirely. "This is what you're asking us to restore," Kalen continued, his voice heavy with compassion. "Not just personal memories but generational trauma. The accumulated suffering of our entire species. These people are naturally resistant to the pollen's blessed effects. They remember not just their own pain but the pain of their ancestors, passed down like a genetic curse." Ilara pressed her face to the window of patient 15C's room, watching him write with desperate intensity. The walls were covered with dates, names, detailed descriptions of violence and loss that made her stomach clench. But there were other things too. Expressions of love so deep they took her breath away, descriptions of art and music and poetry born from suffering, accounts of sacrifices made for others that brought tears to her eyes. "They remember the beauty too," she whispered. "Yes," Kalen acknowledged, "but the beauty is inseparable from the pain. Love deep enough to matter requires the risk of loss. Art profound enough to change the world springs from suffering. Joy meaningful enough to sustain us grows from the soil of remembered sorrow." He touched the window gently. "Is that a gift worth giving? Or a burden too cruel to bear?" They moved deeper into the ward, past dozens of cells containing the naturally resistant. Some rocked in corners, overwhelmed by the weight of history. Others created obsessively, art, music, writing, as if they could somehow process the enormity of human experience through creative expression. A few simply sat in perfect stillness, their eyes holding depths of knowledge that seemed too vast for any individual mind to contain. The original colonists faced this choice, Kalen explained as they walked. They had fled the Earth wars, carried with them the trauma of a species that had nearly destroyed itself. Some wanted to remember, to learn from the past. Others wanted to forget, to start fresh. The arguments nearly tore the colony apart. "So you chose for them." "We chose mercy." The memoria trees were already being developed for terraforming. It was a simple matter to enhance their pollen with compounds that would ease the burden of memory. Each generation would remember enough of their own lives to function, but the weight of history would lift from their shoulders. They reached the end of the corridor, where a large window looked into what appeared to be a conference room. Inside, a group of patients sat around a table, engaged in what looked like intense discussion. Their faces were animated with passion, anger, joy, emotions Ilara realized she hadn't seen in years outside the undertree. "Our most successful cases," Kalen said. "They've learned to process their memories, to find meaning in suffering without being destroyed by it. But look closely at their eyes, Ilara. Look at the cost of that wisdom." She looked and gasped. The patient's eyes held such depths of sorrow that she had to step back from the window. These were people who had experienced the full spectrum of human emotion, who carried within themselves the accumulated grief of generations. They were magnificent and terrible, wise and broken, more fully human than anyone she had ever encountered. And they looked exhausted. Soul-deep, bone-weary, tired in a way that sleep could never cure. "This is the choice you face," Kalen said gently. "Not just for yourself but for everyone in New Eden. The Terminator seeds you carry, yes, we know about them, can indeed reverse the pollen's effects. But they cannot undo the fundamental nature of human memory. To remember fully is to suffer fully. To live with the complete truth of what we are and what we've done." Ilara's hand moved to her research bag, feeling the weight of the seeds inside. "Why haven't you stopped me?" "Because choice matters, even if we've removed it from most of our citizens. You and the undertree represent the conscience of our society. The question of whether forgetting is mercy or murder deserves to be asked, even if we don't like the answer." "And if I choose to release the Terminator pollen?" Kalen smiled sadly. "Then we'll watch our beautiful garden descend into chaos." People will remember wars they never fought, feel grief for losses they never experienced, carry rage for injustices committed generations ago. Some will thrive. There are always those who find strength in truth no matter how painful. But others will break, and all will suffer. And if I don't? Then the piece continues. Children grow up happy and content. Adults find meaning in simple pleasures. Art remains beautiful rather than profound. Love stays gentle rather than transformative. Our species survives in a paradise of ignorance, and perhaps that's enough. Ilara stood at the window, watching the fully remembering patients discuss something with passionate intensity. One woman was crying, but her tears seemed to spring from deep wells of compassion rather than personal pain. A man gestured animatedly, his face alive with the kind of intellectual excitement she hadn't seen since her childhood. Another sat quietly, listening, but his silence held the weight of someone who truly understood the complexity of what was being discussed. They were broken. They were beautiful. They were completely, terrifyingly human. "I need to think," she said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, the pollen affects even those with natural resistance if they're exposed long enough. Your clarity won't last forever." As if summoned by his words, the soft chime of the building's air circulation system announced another wave of pollen release. Through the ward's windows, Ilara could see the golden particles beginning to drift past, beautiful and deadly as falling stars. She had perhaps an hour before her thoughts began to soften around the edges, before the question seemed less urgent and the status quo more appealing. An hour to choose the fate of everyone she had ever known. The elevator ride to the ground floor felt endless. In her bag, the Terminator seed seemed to pulse with potential, the power to wake an entire world from its gentle dreams, or to curse it with the full burden of consciousness. Outside, New Eden stretched before her in all its peaceful glory. Citizens moved through their daily routines with serene contentment. Children played games where no one could lose because no one remembered the concept of failure. Adults conducted conversations that meandered pleasantly without the weight of strong opinions or passionate disagreements. It was beautiful. It was horrible. It was both paradise and prison, salvation and damnation. Silas and the Undertree waited for her in the industrial district, their scarred faces eager for her decision. They had chosen pain over ignorance, had carved their identities into their own flesh rather than surrender them to the pollen's gentle erasure. They were the guardians of memory in a world that had forgotten the value of remembering. But in the memory ward, she had seen what complete remembering cost. The patients there carried not just their own experiences but the accumulated trauma of their entire species. They were wise, passionate, fully alive, and utterly exhausted by the weight of being human. The choice was impossible. Either option would cause suffering. Either option would save some and damn others. But as she walked through the quiet streets of New Eden, past the beautiful memoria trees with their golden pollen drift, Ilara realized that some choices had to be made not because they were right, but because they were necessary. The question was not whether humanity deserved to remember or forget. The question was whether they deserved the right to choose. She reached into her bag and closed her fingers around the Terminator seeds, feeling their potential weight against her palm. In her other hand, she pulled out her communication device and sent a coded message to Silas. "Tonight, Atmospheric Processing Center. Bring everyone who can still remember why memory matters." As the sun set over New Eden and the evening pollen fall began its gentle descent, Dr. Ilara Vance made her choice. The Atmospheric Processing Center stood at the heart of New Eden like a mechanical lung, drawing in air from across the terraformed moon and distributing it through countless vents and circulation systems. If the Terminator pollen was going to reach everyone, this was where it had to be released. Ilara arrived at the facility as the evening shift was ending, her stolen authority credentials still valid despite her morning's unauthorized tour of the memory ward. The building's security was minimal. In a society of chemically induced compliance, who would think to commit sabotage? Silas and 12 members of the Undertree had already infiltrated the complex through maintenance tunnels, their scarred faces grim with purpose. They moved through the shadows like living museums of human experience, each carrying decades of carefully preserved memory in their marked flesh. The seed cultivation took 6 hours, Ilara whispered as they gathered in the facility's central chamber. The room hummed with massive machinery that processed and distributed New Eden's air supply. The Terminator plants are mature enough to release their counterpollen, but I can't predict the exact effects. The original data was too corrupted. Will it work? Asked Maria, her palm-carved name gleaming in the facility's harsh lighting. It should neutralize the memory-suppressing compounds in the memoria tree's pollen. People will begin to recover their long-term memories within hours. Full recall of suppressed experiences within days. And then? Ilara looked around the circle of faces, people who had chosen to remember despite the cost, who had scarred themselves rather than surrender their identities to chemical peace. Then they'll remember everything. Not just their own lives, but the inherited memories, the cultural trauma, the full weight of what it means to be human. The young man with text covering his scalp, who had carved Thomas Chin, son of rebels, keeper of truth, into his forehead, stepped forward. Some will break. Yes. Some will choose violence over peace. Probably. Art will become darker. Literature will explore pain. Music will carry sorrow. Yes. Love will require more courage because it will risk more pain. Yes. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since entering the facility, Ilara saw something approaching joy in his scarred features. Then they'll be human again. The cultivation chamber sat in the processing center's heart, a small greenhouse where specialized plants were grown to supplement New Eden's atmospheric composition. Ilara had spent the afternoon coaxing the Terminator seeds into rapid growth using accelerated cultivation techniques. The resulting plants were unlike anything in New Eden's gentle flora, twisted, thorny things that seemed to pulse with aggressive life. Their pollen was already beginning to drift from the mature blooms, a darker gold than the memoria tree's gentle dust. Where the two pollens met in the air, they seemed to cancel each other out, leaving behind only the clean scent of unfiltered atmosphere. Once I activate the distribution system, there's no going back, Ilara said, her hand hovering over the facility's main control panel. Within 6 hours, the Terminator pollen will reach every district of New Eden. Silas nodded, touching the fresh scar he had carved into his arm that morning. Today's date, so he would always remember the day they chose to remember. We know the price. We've always known it. But as Ilara's finger moved toward the activation switch, alarms began echoing through the facility. Emergency lights bathed the chamber in pulsing red, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from multiple corridors. Dr. Vance. Director Kalen's voice carried over the facility's intercom system, calm and regretful. Please step away from the controls. We don't want anyone to be hurt. The Undertree members tensed, hands moving to the crude weapons they had fashioned from maintenance tools. But Ilara held up a hand, stopping them. You said choice mattered, she called out to the unseen director. It does. But not all choices can be honored. Some decisions are too dangerous to leave to individuals, even well-meaning ones. Authority security forces poured into the chamber, not the gentle peacekeepers of New Eden streets, but hard-faced individuals whose eyes held the focused intensity of people unaffected by the pollen. They moved with military precision, surrounding the Undertree members but not yet attacking. Kalen appeared behind them, his expression genuinely pained. These are our enforcement division, he explained. They undergo regular treatments to maintain immunity to the pollen's effects. They remember everything, Ilara. They know exactly what will happen if you release that counteragent. One of the enforcement officers stepped forward and Ilara gasped. She recognized him, or rather, she recognized the absence where her memory of him should be. He was perhaps 30, but his eyes held the weariness she had seen in the memory ward patients. I'm Captain Marcus Webb, he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had learned to suppress emotion out of necessity. I was born in the industrial district, grew up among people like your friends here. People who chose to remember. He gestured toward his unmarked skin. I don't carry my memories and scars because I can't forget them anyway. Natural resistance like the patients you saw today. The director recruited me because someone has to do the difficult work of maintaining peace. You're one of them, Silas breathed. A natural resistor working for the authority. I remember my grandmother's stories about the Earth Wars, Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving Ilara's. Genocide, famine, cities turned to glass by atomic fire. I remember my father's accounts of the colonial conflicts. Children turned into soldiers, populations enslaved, entire worlds stripped bare for resources. I carry all of it, Dr. Vance. Every atrocity, every loss, every moment of suffering that brought us to this moon. His hand moved to his sidearm but didn't draw it. I also remember the day the pollen protocols were implemented. I was 12, old enough to understand what was happening. I watched an entire generation's trauma simply fade away. I saw my parents stop crying at night. I watched former enemies become friends because they could no longer remember why they had fought. And you think that was right? Thomas challenged, his scarred scalp catching the emergency lights. I think it was necessary. Marcus's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Dr. Vance, you've seen what complete memory does to people. You've witnessed the cost of carrying our species' full history. Would you truly wish that burden on every citizen of New Eden? On the children playing in the parks? On the elderly tending their gardens? Ilara's hand still hovered over the activation controls. Around her, the standoff continued. The Undertree members ready to fight for their right to remember, the enforcement officers prepared to preserve the peace through violence if necessary. There's another option, Kalen said quietly. Join us. Use your botanical expertise to improve the pollen's effects, to make the forgetting more complete, more humane. Help us create a true paradise where suffering is impossible. You want me to make the prison more comfortable. I want you to help us save our species from itself. The Terminator plants pulsed with dark energy, their pollen already beginning to drift through the chamber's air circulation systems. In a few minutes, it would be too late to stop the process even if she wanted to. But as Ilara looked around the chamber, at the scarred faces of the Undertree, at the weary eyes of the enforcement officers, at Director Kalen's genuinely compassionate expression, she realized the choice had already been made. Not by her, but by every person in New Eden who had accepted the gentle forgetting, who had chosen peace over truth, comfort over consciousness. They had voted with their compliance, their willingness to drift through days unmarked by passion or pain. Except for the Undertree. Except for the patients in the memory ward. Except for the enforcement officers who carried the burden of choice so others wouldn't have to. A small group of people who had decided that being human was worth the cost of remembering what that meant. I'm sorry, Ilara said, and slammed her hand down on the activation control. The facility's distribution system roared to life with mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the moon's foundations. Massive fans began drawing the Terminator pollen into the atmospheric circulation network, mixing it with the regular air supply that flowed to every district of New Eden. The enforcement officers raised their weapons, but Marcus held up a hand, stopping them. It's done, he said simply. The reaction is already too widespread to contain. Through the chamber's windows, they could see the Terminator pollen beginning to mix with the Memoria tree's golden drift. Where the two pollens met, they neutralized each other in tiny sparks of light, like miniature fireworks celebrating the end of an era. Kalen closed his eyes, his face showing the grief of someone watching a beloved child make a terrible mistake. May whatever God still listen forgive us all. The first screams began 20 minutes later. They started in the industrial districts where the Terminator pollen reached first, carried by winds that had been carefully calculated to distribute the Memoria tree's gentle forgetting. But now those same currents carried the sharp edge of remembrance, cutting through chemically induced peace like a blade through silk. From her position at the processing center's observation deck, Ilara watched New Eden's transformation begin. The change wasn't visible at first. People simply stopped walking, stood perfectly still as their minds processed the sudden return of suppressed memories. Then the crying started. Not the gentle tears of daily sadness, but the raw, ugly sobs of people remembering losses they had forgotten. A woman collapsed outside a bakery, clutching her head as she recalled the death of a child whose name the pollen had stolen. A man stood screaming at the sky, his mind flooded with memories of violence he had either witnessed or committed. But there were other reactions too. A group of teenagers who had been playing a listless game suddenly embraced each other with desperate intensity, remembering friendships that had depth and history. An elderly couple sat on a bench, holding hands as they wept, not from pain but from the return of a love story that spanned decades. It's working, Silas whispered, his scarred face streaked with tears. They're remembering. The enforcement officers had withdrawn to the facility's perimeter, not to prevent escape but to document what was happening. Marcus stood beside Ilara, his expression unreadable as he watched his peaceful world descend into chaos. Second wave should reach the central districts in an hour, he said clinically. That's where the real test will be. 3 million people suddenly remembering everything they've been chemically encouraged to forget. Will they survive it? some will. His voice held the flat certainty of someone who had seen human nature at its worst and best. Others won't. The question is whether what emerges will be worth what we're destroying. As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed across the city, not screaming but singing. Somewhere in the awakening districts, someone had remembered a song, and others were joining in. The melody was ragged, uncertain, but it carried a passion that had been absent from New Eden's gentle harmonies for generations. Art. Thomas breathed, his text-covered scalp reflecting the light of distant fires, some destructive, others celebratory. They're making art again. The hours that followed were a symphony of human experience in all its terrible, beautiful complexity. As the Terminator pollen reached each district, the residents experienced what could only be described as a mass awakening, not gentle or gradual, but sudden and overwhelming. Emergency services, staffed by enforcement officers immune to the pollen's effects, worked frantically to manage the chaos. Some people, overwhelmed by the sudden return of traumatic memories, required immediate psychological intervention. Others, discovering they had forgotten children, spouses, or entire careers, became violent in their grief and rage. But for every breakdown there was a breakthrough. Artists who had painted only pleasant landscapes suddenly began creating works of staggering emotional depth. Musicians composed symphonies that captured the full spectrum of human experience. Writers began crafting stories that explored themes of loss, love, redemption, and meaning. In the residential districts, families rediscovered each other. Parents remembered the unique personalities of children they had seen as pleasant but unremarkable. Couples recalled the fights and reconciliations that had deepened their relationships beyond simple companionship. The suicide rate will spike, Marcus observed as dawn broke over the transformed city. Depression, violence, social unrest. We'll see crime rates we haven't experienced in centuries. But we'll also see innovation, Ilera replied, watching a group of citizens work together to tend to an elderly woman who had collapsed from memory overload. Passion, creativity, love that transcends simple contentment. Is it worth it? Before she could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. Director Kalen approached across the observation deck, his authority robes torn and stained. His face showed exhaustion, but also something that might have been relief. The central districts have begun remembering, he reported. Government functions are in complete chaos. Half my administrative staff are catatonic from memory shock. The other half have resigned and are demanding investigations into everything we've done for the past 3 centuries. Are you going to stop us? Silas asked, his hand moving to a scarred weapon. Kalen smiled sadly. With what? My enforcement divisions are overwhelmed managing humanitarian crises. My administrative staff are too busy remembering their own suppressed histories to follow orders. And honestly, he looked out over the city where smoke and light painted the sky in equal measure. I'm beginning to remember why I thought this was necessary in the first place. You're not naturally resistant? No. I undergo regular treatments to maintain cognitive clarity for leadership purposes. But the Terminator pollen is interfering with those treatments. I'm starting to recall things I thought I'd chosen to forget. As if to emphasize his words, Kalen's composure cracked slightly. I remember the vote now. The original colonists' decision about the pollen protocols. It wasn't unanimous. 37% wanted to preserve full memory, consequences be damned. We overruled them, told ourselves it was for the greater good. He touched his temple, wincing as if in physical pain. I remember the faces of the people we sent to the memory ward. Not just the naturally resistant, but anyone who questioned our methods too persistently. We told ourselves they were sick, that remembering was a disease we were helping them manage. And now I remember that democracy means living with decisions you disagree with. That freedom includes the right to suffer for your choices. Kalen's voice broke slightly. We created paradise by murdering free will. We saved humanity from itself by making it something less than human. The sun climbed higher over New Eden, illuminating a city in transformation. The gentle, placid society of the morning was gone, replaced by something chaotic, passionate, and undeniably alive. People moved through the streets with purpose, their faces marked by the full spectrum of human emotion. Some districts had organized quickly, with natural leaders emerging to help their neighbors process traumatic memories. Others had descended into violence as old grudges and suppressed conflicts erupted into open warfare. Emergency shelters had been established for those overwhelmed by the sudden return of grief, while community centers had become gathering places for people seeking to reconnect with forgotten family and friends. "The death toll will be significant," Marcus reported, his voice clinically detached from the human cost he was calculating. Conservative estimates suggest 10 to 15% casualty rates from suicide, violence, and accidents caused by memory shock. "But the birth rate will increase too," Thomas added, touching one of his scarred names. "People will remember what it means to love deeply enough to create new life. Children will be born into families that remember their own histories, their own stories. Art, music, literature will flourish," Maria added. "We'll have philosophers again, revolutionaries, people willing to die for ideas they believe in. We'll also have fanatics, terrorists, genocidal maniacs," Marcus countered. "People willing to kill for ideas they believe in." Ilera listened to the debate, but her attention was drawn to a scene playing out in the street below. A group of children, no more than 10 years old, had gathered around an elderly man who was telling them a story. His words were passionate, his gestures dramatic, and the children listened with rapt attention, not the polite focus of New Eden's youth, but the hungry fascination of minds encountering true narrative for the first time. The story seemed to be about heroes and villains, love and loss, sacrifice and redemption. The kind of complex tale that could only emerge from a mind that remembered both joy and sorrow, that understood the relationship between light and shadow. "Look," she said, pointing to the scene. The others followed her gaze, watching as more adults joined the impromptu storytelling session. Soon, a crowd had gathered, and Ilera realized she was witnessing something that hadn't existed in New Eden for generations: the organic formation of community around shared narrative, the human need to process experience through story. "They're healing," she said quietly. "Not quickly, not easily, but they're healing." As the day progressed, patterns began to emerge from the chaos. The city structure was adapting to its awakened population, with new organizations forming spontaneously to address needs that hadn't existed under the pollen's influence. Grief counseling centers, established by people who remembered their own losses. Art collectives, formed by citizens rediscovering their creative passions. Even protest groups, organizing around grievances they had forgotten they held. It was messy, loud, often violent, sometimes beautiful. It was undeniably human. "The other colonies will have to make the same choice eventually," Kalen observed as evening approached. "Word of what happened here will spread. Some will choose to maintain their pollen protocols, others will follow our example. And humanity will fragment," Marcus added. "Some branches choosing peace through forgetting, others accepting suffering for the sake of consciousness." "Maybe that's as it should be," Ilera replied. "Maybe the right to choose our level of humanity is the most human thing of all." As night fell over the transformed city, she stood on the observation deck and listened to the sounds of her new world. Crying and laughter, arguments and songs, the crash of destruction and the ring of construction. The gentle silence of chemical peace had been replaced by the full symphony of human experience. In the distance she could see fires burning, some destructive, others celebratory. Groups of people moved through the streets, some fleeing, others gathering, all driven by passions and purposes that had been chemically suppressed for generations. The Memoria trees still stood, their golden pollen drifting through the night air. But now it mixed with the darker dust of the Terminator plants, creating patterns of light and shadow that reflected the complex beauty of conscious existence. Tomorrow, New Eden would begin the long work of building a society that could accommodate both memory and hope, both individual freedom and collective responsibility. People would have to learn to live with the full weight of their humanity, the capacity for great love and terrible hatred, profound wisdom and devastating foolishness. Some would thrive in this new world. Others would be destroyed by it. Most would simply endure, carrying their memories like sacred wounds, finding meaning in the spaces between joy and sorrow. But they would be human. Completely, terrifyingly, beautifully human. Ilera closed her eyes and listened to the city sing. Not the gentle, mindless harmonies of chemical contentment, but the raw, complex music of conscious beings choosing their own fate. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. And somewhere in that cacophony of awakening minds, she heard the first note of whatever song humanity would choose to sing next.